Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It's good to be with you. Thank you for joining us. In his first address to a joint session of Congress, President Biden declared that America is on the move again and said that the country was, quote, rising anew. He started by acknowledging the historic nature of the evening, noting that he was flanked by two women, Vice President Kamala Harris and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. The president highlighted some of the accomplishments of his first 3 months in office while speaking to more than 200 members of Congress, cabinet officials, and other guests who were all masked and socially distanced. On the coronavirus pandemic, Mr. Biden touted his administration's efforts to vaccinate Americans and relieve some of the economic impacts of the pandemic by passing the American Rescue Plan. The president discussed his administration's efforts to address infrastructure reform through his American Jobs Plan, which he said was a, quote, once-in-a-generation investment in America itself. On climate change, Mr. Biden said the best way to address the nation's climate crisis is to create jobs, and he explicitly called on Congress to pass a $15 an hour federal minimum wage. The president also unveiled his nearly $2 trillion American Families Plan, in which he proposed free preschool and for 3- and 4-year-olds, as well as 2 years of free community college for all Americans. To pay for these proposals, the president said he would raise taxes on wealthy individuals and corporations, but pledged that he would not raise taxes on anyone making under $400,000 per year. President Biden called on Congress to come together on a number of issues, including what he said was a, quote, epidemic of gun violence, as well as passing what he called comprehensive police reform.
Here's some of what
you might have missed.
1 day shy of the 100th day of my administration. 100 days since I took the oath of office and lifted my hand off our family Bible and inherited a nation we all did that was in crisis. The worst pandemic in a century. The worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. The worst attack on our democracy since the Civil War. After I promised we'd get 100 million COVID-19 vaccine shots into people's arms in 100 days, we will have provided over 220 million COVID shots in those 100 days. We kept our commitment, Democrats and Republicans, of sending $1,400 rescue checks to 85% of American households. We've already sent more than 160 million checks out the door. In my view, we also need to make a once-in-a-generation investment in our families and our children. That's why I've introduced the American Families Plan tonight, which addresses 4 of the biggest challenges facing American families and, in turn, America. More than 2 weeks ago in the Rose Garden, surrounded by some of the bravest people I know, the survivors and families who lost loved ones to gun violence, I laid out several of the Department of Justice actions that are being taken to impact on this epidemic. And I'll do everything in my power to protect the American people from this epidemic of gun violence, but it's time for Congress to act as well. Immigration has always been essential to America. Let's end our exhausting war over immigration. For more than 30 years, politicians have talked about immigration reform, and we've done nothing about it. It's time to fix it. As I stand here tonight before you in a new and vital hour of life and democracy of our nation, and I can say with absolute confidence, I have never been more confident or optimistic about America.
Let's bring in Caitlin Huey-Burns and Major Garrett. Caitlin is CBSN's Washington reporter, and Major is our CBS News chief Washington correspondent. All right, I want to start by getting each of your reactions to President Biden's speech. Caitlin, let's start with you. What stood out to you?
Well, we've been talking all day about how this is an address to a joint session of Congress, not the State of the Union, because the president has only been in office for 100 days and hasn't presided over the country enough to assess the State of the Union. And I think it's an important distinction because the president, you heard in a few of those bites there, continued to urge Congress to act. So you could tell that he was sending a message to them, that he wants them to act on a variety of different proposals, from infrastructure to immigration to guns to even voting rights. You heard him say time and time again, just pass it. Let's act. And he also tried to appeal to their sensibilities as lawmakers by referencing many times that he had been sitting in their shoes over and over again as a member of Congress for years, of course, kind of saying, look, I know how these things work. I know how these things go. You need to, we've been working on these issues for a while. You need to pass them now. So I think there were moments where he was offering highlights of his administration that he believes and some goals of where he thinks the country should go. But it was really a direct appeal for congressional action on his priorities. And that's important because while we're only 100 days in, it doesn't seem like a lot. You know how difficult the politics become up here on Capitol Hill once we start getting into midterm election season. And there's this feeling among Democrats up here on the Hill that, look, they could lose the House next year. They could possibly lose the Senate. So why not try to get these big priorities passed now? And Republicans up here have been griping that they are not part of the conversation or haven't been able to be part of the conversation when it comes to some of these big bills. You heard that from Tim Scott, for example, in that response. And so I thought it was just really interesting the way in which he was trying to appeal directly to members of Congress.
And Major, let me ask you the same question. What stood out to you from the president's address?
Well, Elaine, with your permission, I'll talk about not only President Biden's address, but also Tim Scott's Republican response, because, yes, there were parts of both speeches that were not talking directly to each other and have fundamental disagreements. But there was also a Venn diagram sort of component to both speeches in which they were talking about the same things. So there's this part of the speech that Tim Scott and President Biden gave, that talk about the same things but come to different conclusions. What do I mean by that? Tim Scott talked about the pre-pandemic economy. Joe Biden talked about what the country learned as a result of the pandemic, that even though the wage gains that Tim Scott talked about, the low unemployment, none of that was durable in a pandemic. And the pandemic revealed that employers were not as generous to their employees as they should be, that employees on the front line suffered the most, that there were deep racial inequalities there, that women suffered as a result in the workplace. And all those things revealed by the pandemic told us something, according to President Biden and the White House, about what the pre-pandemic economy actually was. From Tim Scott's point of view, he's talking about the pre-pandemic economy as so much better, even than the economy we have now or the economy we're going to have. That's talking about the same thing, but coming to a fundamentally different conclusion. Same thing about police reform. To Tim Scott, it's all about the details of the legislation. To Joe Biden, President Biden and the Biden White House, it's about so much more. It's about, yes, the details of police reform, but also about systemic racism and things that have been part of the U.S. economy in relationship to people of color that have been out of balance for a very, very long time. And that's got to be addressed in addition to the details of police reform. Again, talking about the same thing in the same area, but coming to fundamentally different conclusions. One other thing I would say about Tim Scott's Republican response, and I think it's really important to note this. A couple of things not mentioned. First of all, President Trump, not referenced in any way. China, not referenced in any way. And Obamacare, not referenced in any way. Having covered the 2016 Republican nomination fight, Donald Trump becoming the nominee, and that general election campaign, to have those three things, meaning Trump not the central issue, China not a huge issue in a Republican response, and Obamacare nowhere in the conversation, also what I would say parenthetically, Tim Scott did not talk about gun control legislation or the Second Amendment in the way Donald Trump did, either as candidate or president. Those omissions, to me, are striking as the Republican Party tries to find its new way in a Biden-dominated Washington.
Right, and that was underscored by just the imagery of, you had Kevin McCarthy and you had Liz Cheney, who were socially distanced, but as some folks were talking about on Twitter.
Yes.
Exactly, making that observation as well, that the separation is vast between those two Republicans because of what you just laid out. So, Caitlin, let me ask you sort of a big picture question. You talked about the fact that President Biden laid out some of the key agenda items that he wants to pursue from this point forward. What did all of that roughly kind of outline about his vision regarding the role of government as he sees it in American society now?
You know, it's really interesting having covered Biden as a candidate. In the early days of his candidacy, he was campaigning on kind of just getting things back to normal. And a lot of progressives and liberal voters that we would talk to on the campaign trail would often say, you know, it's not enough to just get back to normal. Well, the COVID situation really kind of flipped everything on its head, and you saw in response as part of the campaign and now the presidency that because of the coronavirus pandemic and the fallout that we've seen, the economic fallout and also the disparities that we've seen this president kind of push for bigger and bolder proposals than he might have pushed for in the past. And again, there's this sense of urgency here. And I thought it was notable that, you know, when he was talking about infrastructure, for example, he said that, you know, he'd like bipartisan support. He'd like Republicans to get on board, but they still, you know, need to pass something soon. They just can't wait around. And as Major noted in our earlier conversation, this idea of what American government means and the idea that that it means the people when he's talking about it, I thought those were really resonant lines. And I also wanted to pick up on something that Tim Scott said, just to go back to that previous conversation, and how Republicans are trying to navigate this post-Trump world and what their message is. And you've seen them really lean into this culture argument. And you heard that from Tim Scott tonight, talking about things from voting rights to other issues, kind of weaving them into this culture argument. And as Republicans are trying to figure out how to, you know, pin Biden down, it seems like they find an effective message on kind of painting a broader brush here and kind of leaning into these arguments. And I think that was really interesting coming from Tim Scott, that's kind of the message that we'll likely hear from Republicans heading into the midterms, given that you know, Biden isn't necessarily, in their view, a divisive figure on his own, but these arguments being waged, they say, by the left are kind of what they're trying to run against.
Yeah, you know, it was underscored also by Senator Scott, noting that some of the vitriol that he has received, as he said, he's been called names by the left, he said, that are part of the discrimination, he says, that he has experienced as a black man in the United States. Let's go ahead and bring in our Leslie Sanchez to this conversation. She is a CBS News political analyst. And Leslie, I want to pick up on what Caitlin was talking about, what Major was talking about a moment ago, and that is Senator Tim Scott's response to President Biden's address. Major noted some omissions in that response by Senator Scott. No mention of President Trump, no mention of guns, no mention of Obamacare. What did you hear in Senator Scott's response?
What was strikingly different, and I thought Major was exactly right to point that out, is he also came across as a very authentic figure speaking his own truth. And at this moment, that's exactly the type of voice that you want to hear, especially when people are wondering, to Caitlin's point, what is the image of this different, this new normal Republican Party? And for him to talk about issues, and this, it reminds me of, it kind of harkens back to what civil debate used to sound like, 20 years ago, if you could even say there was that. But it was an argument about, we can all agree on these problems, but the compassionate approach that perhaps you took for 4 decades, the Republicans' argument would be, didn't work, so let's try something different. And there was a through line with Senator Scott's speech that was saying very much the same thing. I've experienced the same thing. I see the world and can share your vision of how you see the world. but the way we go about it needs to be different. So the tone of how this is different from the Republican Party is what stands out. And he being the right messenger, it's not this kind of bombastic, confrontational that we saw with the previous administration and the previous kind of tone of the Republican Party. It's getting back to a different type of balance. And I think that's going to be extremely effective for Republicans, because instead of these broad strokes like of Biden promising everything and sounding so conciliatory and wanting to have that olive branch and reach out to Republicans, but kind of bringing it back to the reality of what does and doesn't work. That's where Republicans think they can get some leverage. And they're going to aim at that and really take aim at some of these fiscal approaches, the big price tag that Biden had in his speech. And I think we'll be hearing about that over the next couple of days.
Well, Major, there was a much smaller crowd tonight, as we've noted, due to the coronavirus pandemic. And we heard the president talk about his administration's success in getting Americans vaccinated. How important was it for the president to highlight that at the beginning, really, of the address, to sort of lay that out and lay that down first as he then went on to the other points that he wanted to make? Well,
Elaine, let me answer that very good question with a question back to everyone. What would the speech have been, and what would President Biden's political prospects be if after 100 days we were still inching along at about 1 million vaccinations a day, and the death rate and infection rate and hospitalization rates were essentially only nominally better than they were in January and February, meaning that the president and his team did not meet any of the ambitious goals it set when it was inaugurated, and that there is no real prospect of turning the corner on COVID-19, that there are still hot spots and reopening is not foreseeable, and July 4th isn't going to be a metaphorical or actual Independence Day. What would we be talking about? What would be the condition politically, managerially, and effectively of this administration? It would be in the garbage can. It would be a dumpster fire. And that is what's so important about this particular moment and the ability of a address to a joint session of Congress sounding a little bit like a State of the Union address, as I predicted it would before the speech even began, because there were accomplishments aplenty referenced by the president in the opening 5 or 10 minutes, saying, look what we've already done. Look what's already happened. That sounded a little bit like a State of the Union address. And then he could declare, not that the State of the Union is strong, he can't do that yet, but he said, America's moving and we're moving forward. That sounds very much like the opening stanzas of a State of the Union address, and he would not be there if this administration had fallen flat on its face doing the very things it said was most important to its political, managerial, and administrative future, getting its arms around the pandemic. So I answer your question with a question back to the panel. What would we be talking about if this administration had stumbled and mishandled and fumbled all the things it promised to do?
Point taken, Major. It is something that, no doubt, we would be having a very different conversation tonight if that were the case. I want to turn to Control Room. I want to ask for SOT 9 here shortly. The notion of the president looking at education in America in a different way is something that has gotten a lot of attention and a lot of focus. President Biden talked about how early childhood education, according to research, has demonstrated success later for individuals in life. And in making that pitch for what he calls the American Families Plan, suggested this is something that was not an option, but that was necessary for the United States in order to be competitive on the world stage. So let's go ahead and play part of what the president said on that front. SOT 9, Control Room.
That's why my American Families Plan guarantees 4 additional years of public education for every person in America, starting as early as we can. The great universities in this country have conducted studies of the last 10 years. It shows that adding 2 years of universal high-quality preschool for every 3-year-old and 4-year-old, no matter what background they come from, puts them in the position to be able to compete all the way through 12 years and increases exponentially their prospect of graduating and going on beyond graduation. The research shows when a young child goes to school, not daycare, they're far more likely to graduate from high school and go to college or something after high school.
All right, let's bring into this conversation Joel Payne. He is a CBS News political analyst and a CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist. Apologies, Joel, work from home problems here. But we heard that thought from President Biden in reimagining and rethinking the way American education is thought of in this country. Tell me about the idea of the way that's being received right now, in the circles that you have been sort of traveling in and hearing from. This is something that the president pointed to research, as I suggested before the shot played, indicating that this will allow success down the road for Americans and therefore success for the country in competing on the world stage.
Yeah, the president was very aspirational tonight, both in talking about his plans and also talking about a lot of the issues that he's hearing about in the first 100 days of his presidency. There are things that he hasn't had a chance to get to. I think he spent most of the second half of that speech talking about other topics he wants to focus on, like what you're discussing. He obviously talked about police reform. He talked about a lot of foreign affairs issues. But I think with this, I think it's really a theme throughout the Biden presidency and throughout this speech. And I think it's bringing the temperature down and creating hope and creating something for people to look forward to, really speaking aspirationally. And I think you heard the president do that a lot. That is very consistent with his style, and it's been pretty successful for him if you look at his poll numbers and you look at his standing right now politically throughout the country, and I think he's hoping that that continues throughout.
Leslie, I'm curious, is universal preschool a place where perhaps there could be some bipartisan agreement?
There certainly has been a lot of agreement, evidence-based research to support the idea of exactly what he's talking about, especially for underserved communities, many lower-income communities that do not have access because of financial limitation to put their children in quality a preschool or Montessori or any resources that more affluent families have. This could balance out because those educational disparities only get larger as the children grow and move, and the risk of dropouts, high school dropouts, and the things the president was talking about are very real. I was paying a lot of attention to the last part of his 4-year plan, which was the 2 years of, I believe, community college or free education, sounding very much like the progressive left talking about it again. That's where Republicans start, wringing their hands. What is the cost? Would this be for everyone? It really destabilizes the current higher education system in a way where you're penalizing the haves and have-nots. So that's the part I feel Republicans are going to pay attention to. It's a really good concept in theory, but again, how would you pay for it, and who would be best served by that plan?
Leslie, we also heard the president touch on immigration reform, and I want to read part of a statement. This is from Arizona Senator Mark Kelly. It reads in part, quote, "While I share President Biden's urgency in fixing our broken immigration system, what I didn't hear tonight was a plan to address the immediate crisis at the border, and I will continue holding this administration accountable to deliver the resources and staffing necessary for a humane, orderly process as we work to improve border security, support local economies, and fix our immigration system." Let me ask you, Leslie, from your vantage point, is there any way at all for Republicans and Democrats to work together on this issue, even when members of the president's own party are not satisfied with how he's handling the current situation?
It gets incredibly political. I want to be the hopeful one, Elaine, because something needs to be done urgently for the people for the crisis that is falling squarely on the shoulders of this administration. There is a clear message and an understanding that by removing some of Trump's executive orders and his policies, that it has caused this flood on the border. The Republicans want this crisis to move into a phase where they can understand what is going to be done. Are there going to be more asylum judges? Are you going to move more resources to kind of manage the flow? Is there going to be a system? And the question is going to be, is it going to be under the auspices of comprehensive immigration reform, kind of a one big solution, or are they going to parse this out, which has never been successful? And who's going to champion that? So the president's going to have to take leadership. Again, there's a lot of sour attitudes about it because under President Obama, there was supposed to be immigration reform in the first 100 days, and it just never transpired. So a lot of people feel that that's not a genuine approach by the Democrats, and they want and are looking for something different. And that's on the Democratic side, and Republicans are certainly going to focus on border security before they focus on anything else.
Elaine, can I jump in real quick?
Please.
So I said before the speech that was one thing I was going to look for, what the president did or didn't say about immigration. Now, no one cares what I'm wanting to hear, but it sounds like Senator Mark Kelly wanted to hear things too. And I guarantee you Henry Cuellar, Democrat from Texas, who was on the takeout with me last week, wanted to hear something too. And I guarantee you they're both dissatisfied for the same reason. Because from their vantage point, and I would say, and I will defer to Caitlin on this because she's up on the Hill much more frequently than I am, most moderate Democrats who feel that they're going to face a tough re-election in 2022 wanted to hear the president say all the things he said aspirationally about immigration, but also they wanted him to say, hey, we have a problem. It's a problem right now. Here's why we have the problem. Here's how I'm trying to manage it. And here's what I think the next 3 or 4 months are going to look like and how I'm going to manage it going forward. Without referencing what's going on the border right now, more than 22,000 unaccompanied children in the custody of Health and Human Services, 1,000 in Border Patrol facilities, that's a problem. That is a serious management problem. It's a humanitarian issue. Are they being tested? Are they not being tested? Why can't the media get in to see them? What's the transparency? These are real issues. These are not phony, made-up issues. And I guarantee you one of the things that Senator Kelly from Arizona is criticizing this administration about is you didn't even reference it. This is happening right now. It's happening in his state. It's happening in neighboring New Mexico, California, and Texas. And that problem needs to have some voice placed behind it for the President of the United States. Not just saying, oh, Kamala Harris is going to be our diplomatic liaison with El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. That's fine. But what does that have to do, and how are you explaining it in a practical, understandable way to Americans who look at these numbers and say, that doesn't look right to me? And the polling data, as I suggested before the speech, in one area and one area alone for this administration is distinctly underwater, and it's on the management of the southern border. And Mark Kelly's statement reflects that level of Democratic anxiety. It's not shared by all Democrats. I wouldn't suggest that it is. But that it's shared by Mark Kelly is an indication that other Democrats wanted to hear more than they heard tonight.
And it's something that we're going to continue to
Elaine,
watch.
Can I?
Yes, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. No, I was going to say, you know, Major started by saying what would happen if he hadn't really had success on the vaccinations. The president made a focus of the pandemic and the vaccinations and moving that forward. And there was a plan and a team, and he was involved in it day by day. And the delta between that type of action and management that Major talked about and what you don't see on immigration just shows you there's not an intention or a seriousness in resolving that, which is really kind of the point. And that neither the president or the vice president have gone to the border, and all of these calls have been taken. But it just shows you when the president wants to focus on something, they can be very effective at it, and it's just silence and crickets on, you know, with respect to the crisis on the border.
And we'll see if the reaction from. Yeah, go ahead, Caitlin, please.
Oh, just quickly to jump in and kind of talk about the dynamics here on the Hill that Major mentioned. Absolutely, among Democrats and Republicans feel very little political incentive to work on immigration reform up here because of what's happening on the border. Earlier today, I talked to Congressman Mike McCall, who now is the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, but previously he was the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee. And I asked him, are Republicans willing to get on board with some immigration reform? And he said, to be honest with you, not really, because of what's happening on the border. There's just no political incentive there. So this is the problem facing this administration, if they want to get something done on immigration, is not only holding the Democratic caucus together, but getting any sort of support. And that's why last week you saw members from the Hispanic caucus go to the White House and urge the president to consider, supporting something through reconciliation on immigration, because they kind of, realize it's going to be very difficult to get support. And the political incentives here on the Hill have changed so dramatically on immigration over the past few years. I know we all covered the passage of comprehensive immigration reform in the Senate several years ago, but that was in reaction to Republicans losing the 2012 election and feeling like they needed to gain back voters. The dynamic is completely different after Trump, and Republicans say, hey, look, we gained Latino voters in the past election, and then they haven't really paid a price for their stances on immigration. Those are just kind of the dynamics up here that lawmakers, talk openly about.
Yeah, we have been watching Camilo Montoya Galvez, our CBS News immigration reporter, who has been reporting from the U.S. southern border. There is no doubt what is taking place there is an urgent situation. Caitlin Huey-Burns, Major Garrett, Leslie Sanchez, and Joel Payne, so great to see you all again. Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.